Because I've been afraid and was taught that I should just sort of ignore my fears. So what I tend to do is do really, big acts that take a lot of courage so that I feel like I'm courageous.
Okay, so how could I summarise that?
Pretend.
Well, you take an action that you are actually afraid of in order to make you feel that you're not afraid, but you're still really afraid even after you've done it. Yeah. So what is the feeling or the belief that you're trying to avoid? It's the terror or fear, isn't it?
Yeah, I can't cope with fear.
Yeah. And so basically there's a few things we do with fear. One is we do what you do. So this is what men generally do with their fear. They actually go and do risky things in order to prove themselves they're not afraid of it, but they still have the fear inside of themselves, so they're still just as afraid afterwards as they were before. Does that make sense? And a lot of men in particular do that. What do a lot of women do with their fear? Many of you ladies will know because you do this quite frequently. Somebody?
Hide.
You hide, but what do you mean by hide?
Like not engage.
So you run away from situations that you probably shouldn't engage.
Yeah.
Yep, very true. Nina, thank you.
I will do what I think they want me to do so that I can avoid their anger.
Okay,
and feel safe.
so you pander to the fear.
Yes.
You sort of basically, you don't challenge your fear, you just pander to it. You do what the fear dictates you to do.
With the illusion that at that moment I'm going to be safe.
Yes.
And that I'm going to stay out of trouble.
Yes, so so a lot of people try to confront it without feeling it, of course. That's that one that I first mentioned. Second group of people generally pander to it. Right? Are there other things that you do with your fear? Behind, Jen?
If I haven't avoided it, the other thing I do is push to get what I want.
Okay, so it's more you revert to anger then, isn't it?
Yeah,
Basically.
I guess that is an anger action, huh?
But here I'm trying to talk about some fear-based addictions rather than reversions to anger. So often, most people when they're in fear revert to anger. That is a very common form of handling fear, yes. But if you don't revert to anger, what else do you do, is the question I'm probably asking. Up the back, thanks Julia.
I'm not sure, but would it be to just eliminate anything that makes me fearful or trigger my fear, so to make my life small and hide?
Yeah, well, that's really already been brought up, hasn't it? Sort of hiding or withdrawing. So let's write that down. What else might we have if we come down?
I would just go and have a good strong cup of tea and a caffeine boost.
Right. So we take a substance that improves our handling of the fear.
Yes.
So we revert to substance abuse of some kind, even if it's a cup of tea. It's an abuse because it's shutting down. It's an abuse of ourselves, actually, because we're shutting down our fear. Yep. What else do we do? So some kind or form of substance abuse. Come on, you ladies. You are used to handling your fear in lots of different ways than just this, and so are some of you guys. Connie.
Get a man to take it away?
Yes. You get someone else to take it away for you. Yes? So what would you call that? You call that getting a rescue, wouldn't you? From your fear. Right? Many of you revert to that. Yeah, that's a very common one for women to revert to. Yeah, because most men think that they are really nice men if they do that for you. Yeah? And that's why that most men willingly rescue women. Of course, there's always usually a price, and usually the price is usually sexual, But most women are willing to pay the sexual price for the rescue, even. Yeah, isn't that the case? So that's very common. What else?
I'm not sure if this is under pander, but I get excited or happy with I'm afraid. Like if I'm talking with somebody and I feel afraid of them, like I'll act.
So could you say you get hyped up and busy, like emotionally and physically?
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's methods of what I would classify as distraction from fear. And getting all hyped up and busy is one of those methods of distraction. So can I just put them all under distraction? A lot of people, when they feel afraid, the very first thing they do is go and do something else. Yeah? As soon as they're afraid, bang, go off doing something else. And you find people who go and do one thing and do another thing and do another thing and do another thing in the course of the day and never get anything finished is generally because they're afraid of finishing everything. And they go from one to another to another to another. Why would you be afraid of finishing anything? Well, you'll need to talk into the mic if you get forward, yeah? Is it?
Then there would be nothing left to distract you.
Agreed, but there's probably other reasons too, if you think about it. Some of you do this, so you would know why you do it, surely. Down. If we go across there, actually go across there first. Yep.
If I finish it, it will be judged.
Exactly. So it's a fear of actually finishing it and then having the job judged in some way. Does that make sense? A lot of people have that, where they're afraid to finish something because they'll finish up being judged for it, for whatever the final output was or whatever the final thing was. Yep.
Just denying it?
Denying the fear, but it's very hard to deny fear. Okay. So you usually use a tool of some kind to deny it.
Because I was taught ignore it.
Okay, well, ignoring it's different than denying it.
Okay. Yeah. To ignore it, you find a distraction usually.
Exactly, yeah. That's right. You revert to one of these other things generally to ignore. Yeah. It's very hard to deny fear without reverting to an addiction. This is why we always revert to addictions generally. Thanks, Michael. Over here.
How about going out of body? Just take it off.
Yes, absenting yourself. So if you can't physically absent yourself, which I notice a lot of you do, you spiritually absent yourself by just going away, going to sleep. You know, I have an uncle that anything he doesn't want to hear, he goes for a sleep for a while. And he's learnt to sleep with his eyes open. It's very, very, very disconcerting when you... He's got his eyes open and sort of staring. And then you put your hand in front of him like this and nobody's home. But his eyes are still open. He's learnt to do that, right? Because if he closes his eyes, he gets criticised. You see? So what he's learnt to do, he's so good at absenting himself now that he absents himself and keeps his eyes open while he's doing it. It's pretty amazing, isn't it? What a gift. Yeah. I don't know if it is such a gift, but it's just amazing, isn't it, that somebody will revert to such a strong way of absenting themselves just in order to avoid some kind of attack from their environment. Yeah. If you come across to fluid again. So I write that one down. That's absenting yourself. I'm sorry, you might not see these on the board. So absenting yourself, going away.
I have that addiction.
You have that addiction. Good on you for admitting it. Do you ever go to sleep
with my eyes open?
With your eyes open?
Yeah. In college, I did it regularly.
Wow. Yeah. It's a great way in college because everybody still thinks you're paying attention.
Absolutely.
And you're actually having a good snooze. Yeah. Of course, you miss out on a lot of information too. But how did you do in college?
I did fine.
Yeah, did fine, yeah. Probably listened to it in your sleep state a bit just to keep on track. Yeah. Yeah. Can you see the tools we use here? There's so many of them. These are all addictions that prevent you from feeling your fear. Can you see? See, unless we understand what we do, we'll never get to our fear because we're always preventing ourselves from feeling our fear. Yeah? And this applies to every emotion you can think. Shame is another. What do you do? Let's list shame, because shame is a huge emotion generally. It's related to fear in its nature, but usually it results to some kind of personal shame or sexual shame. So if we just write down shame second as another one, what do you do to get away from the feeling of your shame? Ideas? Yeah, if we go.
Take on a superior attitude, so I don't have to feel the...
So what do you mean by taking on the superior attitude?
Like I'm better than everyone else.
Okay, so we become arrogant.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a false arrogance. Arrogance. Yeah, we do that. Yeah. To avoid shame. What else? We come across the...
We use humor, or we laugh it off.
Very good. We use humour. You don't spell humour that way here, do you? Do you? Without the O, is it here? It's just H-O-M-O-R, is it here? Yeah. Humour, yep. Use humour.
I would avoid sex.
So you avoid sex when it comes to sexual shame. Yep. So it's a way of just detuning from your body. And many women have detuned from their body so much that they feel they can't even orgasm anymore. Like they can't even complete what God designed you to complete. You can't even complete it anymore. And that is like a complete detunement from the sexual organs even. We even physically detune from the sense of touch as a result of wanting to get away from certain shame or fears. So,
it kind of comes under arrogance, but criticize others.
Very good. So pull down others in order to make yourself feel better. Is that not the case? So we could say we become highly critical of others in order to make ourselves feel better.
Surround ourselves with people who are more shameful than ourselves.
Exactly. This is a very common thing where we get to feel superior not by pulling down others, but by spending most of our time with people we believe are inferior. Does that make sense? So in other words, we spend most of our time associating with people who are in a poorer condition than ourselves, or what we believe ourselves. We're actually associating with people who we believe are in the same condition as ourselves. Right? But we often associate with them. Yeah. Thanks, Enrique.
Seek glory and retreat into fantasy.
Very true, yes. So glory seeking and fantasy. And fantasy can be all sorts of fantasy, from sexual fantasies right the way through to fantasies involving computer games and always watching movies and tuning out of our life completely even. We often choose to even do those things. There's one we haven't mentioned sexually that's probably a fairly big one that we need to be aware of too. Yeah? Any ideas there, Julie?
Would it be the opposite of avoid sex, but actually engage overly in sexual behavior?
Yes. Yes, either in our awake state or our sleep state. That's often what we do to avoid shame. So what we do is we become enraged with the fact that we feel shame, and what we try to do is make the shame cool. Does that make sense? We try to make it so that it's a cool thing. So, many people who are involved in tantric sexual practices and wife swapping and all these other things, they've all come to believe that their shame is cool. They try to make their shame have everyone who engages in those things feels the approval of the shameful condition. Does that make sense? So this is a big thing that many people choose to do. Have an approval of the shameful condition by taking certain actions that allow themselves to avoid their own feelings of shame. Yeah? Carol?
Like abuse of self, like let's say it was like religious, you'd want to like almost punish yourself?
Yes, self-castigation
Yeah,
is a
definitely.
huge thing. It religiously can revolve around practices that are encouraged by certain religious faiths to punish yourself for what they classify as your sins. So there are some practices that allow even the beating of yourself for your own sins in order to avoid the feeling of shame. Does that make sense? So rather than feel ashamed, you would rather have a painful action that you take. So a lot of people, this is why many women finish up cutting their wrists in order to suicide. It's not actually about suicide most of the time. A lot of times it's about the avoidance of shame, personal feelings of shame, that causes them to take such an action. So, people who mark themselves with a knife, even tattooing. Exactly. Even tattooing can be a way of avoiding personal shame. Yeah.
I've actually talked to spirits in the hells that are castigating themselves, trying to do it enough so that God will then come and say you've done it enough, and they wonder why that they're not there, or they're punishing themselves and they're waiting for their husbands to come, because if they aren't in the act of punishing themselves when their husbands get there, then they're afraid of what their husbands are going to be doing.
Correct. And many of us have learnt to do this in our childhood because we learnt that the way to avoid the violence of our parents was to perpetrate violence towards ourselves. When a person perpetrates violence towards themselves, it's highly unlikely the parent will then also perpetrate violence. Does that make sense? And so many children have learned, and when we become adults, we do perpetrate violence to ourselves in order to avoid the violence coming from others. So and it can even be with spirit attack, to avoid the attack of spirits, you do what the spirits want you to do. So if the spirits want you to attack yourself, you attack yourself. And then you avoid their attack. Right? These are all very dark things that happen as a result of not wanting to feel certain childhood experiences and emotions, or certain childhood beliefs. Mary?
Exposing others to your shameful behaviour, or yourself even, physically, in order to almost shame them. Well,
there's two actions that we take there, isn't there? One is to shame them, and the other one is to sort of angrily place our shame on show. We do both of those things.
And also to make fun of people who, like I know someone who was abused as a child who often ends up at parties saying, yeah, let's all get naked and run around, or, oops, I nearly exposed myself, and then laughing at other people when they feel a bit embarrassed about that.
Yep. Laughing at the prudishness of others, for example.
So sort of making out that you're kind of together and cool, you're not ashamed.
Exactly.
But hey, you're a bit embarrassed by...
Yes, yeah. And pointing out other people's embarrassment all the time. So whenever you notice, there are some people that are hypersensitive to other people's embarrassment, and in fact they do things in order to make other people feel embarrassed. And usually those people have, that's their addiction, to avoid their own embarrassment and shame. Does that make sense?
I think I use my weight as a way to redirect my shame, perhaps for something else.
So protection, shall we call that? Self-protection? How often people do is use weight, like physical weight, as a way of protecting them from sexual projections, or protecting them from other shameful projections. So in other words, sometimes what we do is we create an alternative in order to avoid the actual thing. And often with weight, with putting weight on our body, is we're trying to protect ourselves in a number of different ways. But sometimes, for many women in fact, it's related to trying to protect themselves from sexual attractions from men. So in other words, if they were slim and physically, sexually attractive, they'd have more men interested in them. They don't want more men interested in them. They want less men interested in them. And so what they do is they decide to harm themselves by putting on weight so that they don't receive the sexual projections of men. And a lot of that is because they don't want to feel the shame they feel when they receive the sexual projection of men. Many women have been taught that if they feel they receive a sexual projection of men, it's because they wanted it. And so many women grow up feeling, I don't want it, and I'm even going to create a body that says to you, I don't want it. Does that make sense? Yeah. Carolyn, thanks.
Just in furthering that question, I was wondering if you had that belief in your life, would that transfer onto your children? Like, could that be a generational belief for women in your lineage?
It will definitely be a generational belief. Every belief you have that you do not release from yourself automatically is passed down to each child. Yeah. So, of course, if you're a woman, and you have girl children, of course, all of the girls that you have will all take on, to a degree, some of your beliefs, depending on who they associate with, in terms of, do they associate themselves mostly with dad's opinion of women or mum's opinion of women? Does that make sense? And usually most children associate themselves with both, in a normal family, associate themselves with both parents' opinion. So there's usually a mixture of both dad and mum's opinions. Now, if you look at many religious faiths, including the Christian religious faith, and most of its sub cultures, if you like, most of it is based around the fact that women are not allowed to teach in the congregation because there's something, obviously, there's the implication that there's something shameful, or there's an implication that the woman is weaker than the man in some way, or an implication that the woman doesn't have a developed intellect enough to teach, and in each case there's something to be ashamed of. And so, of course, in most multi-generational families involved in religious faiths, there is this constant passing down from the adult to the child of those belief systems. So these are all addictions we engage to avoid feelings relating to these childhood beliefs. Now, of course, we could go on again all day about all of these things, couldn't we? What I'm trying to attempt to do with you is to help you engage in your own process of discovery and how to go through the process of discovery. So what we had to do here is we had to come to terms with what you believe from your childhood, and then what we've been trying to do is what we've been trying to look at personally, what do I do to avoid feeling the childhood feeling that created the belief? That's where our addictions all lay. Avoiding, are the things we do to avoid feeling the childhood belief. Does everyone get that? Now, what I would encourage you to do is spend a lot of time on this, a lot of personal time on this. It's your addictions that, remember I said to you 2 days ago, it's your addictions which are the expression of your will towards God and towards the world around you, right? So when you stay in an addiction, you're telling God you don't want to deal with a certain childhood belief that's out of harmony with love. That's what you're doing. When you desire to stay in the addiction, you're desiring to not deal with that false belief. And God's going to say to you, okay, you're allowed to do that. It's your life. You're allowed to do that as long as you want. So if you want to do that 1,000 years, you can do that 1,000 years. God's not going to get upset with you doing it for 1,000 years. Of course, God is very compassionate with you, thinking, why do you want to do it for 1,000 years when you could work for 5 days on the issue and be over it? It doesn't make much sense to God, but often we feel it makes sense because of our fear and other emotions. So what I encourage you to do now is to really take this stuff home about the addictions that we've gone through so far, and these sets of beliefs, and also what you do to avoid these sets of beliefs, avoid feeling them. What will happen is this. If you can think of your core emotion as like a ball here, right here, and then every addiction you use is like a layer over the top of the emotion. Does that make sense? So it's like a layer that builds over the top of the emotion. So let's perhaps draw that so that you have a good idea of what it sort of looks like conceptually. So if you imagine that this is an emotion which is a belief from your childhood, and remember, all beliefs from your childhood generally are emotions. So here's the belief from your childhood. Now we'll just make it one belief. Usually we have created 5, 6, 8, or even 10 or 12 or 15 different ways that we control that belief through an addiction. So we have layers of different addictions that are methods. So you could call the addictions, so these are all addictions. They are methods to help avoid feeling that, the belief. Now, there's many of them are like layers. Now, I'll just want to tell you something about these layers. You have your favourites. Do you understand what I mean by that? With some of these beliefs that you have inside, you have a favourite way of dealing with it. So for some of you, the favourite way of dealing with one belief might be food. For other of you, the favourite way of dealing with the same belief might be having a cigarette. Or the favourite way of dealing with another belief might be getting a certain emotion from your mother. You know, that we all have our favourite ways. And then we have ways that we use that don't work that we put into play when our favourite doesn't work. Does that make sense? They're our backup plans. All right? So usually we have what you would classify as a favourite, and you spell that O-R-I-T-E, don't you? Yeah? Okay, we use a U in there as well. So you have a favourite way, a favourite method of avoiding, in other words, a favourite addiction. Now, remember, it can be emotional, physical, or spiritual. So it could be any kind of these addictions that you revert to as your favourite method. So sometimes I've noticed with people with fear, their favourite method is to just say, I'm over that now, which is like completely avoiding the knowledge of the fact they're afraid, for example. That's their favourite method. But as soon as you expose that method, what happens? Plan B kicks in the face. And there's all sorts of plan B, plan C, plan D. And depends on how much we've been challenged in our past on that addiction as to how many plans we make. Does that make sense to everyone? So if you've not been ever challenged on an addiction or on a belief, you will probably have one favourite method of dealing with it, and that's all. All right? But if you've been challenged through your life through the law of attraction over and over and over again, and in different ways, then you might have 20 different ways that you eventually revert to avoid the belief. And some of them are circuitous. In other words, we go from one way, that doesn't work, we go the next way, that doesn't work, the next way, and that doesn't work. Then we're back to the original way, trying that again. You know, we revert back to even the ones we tried at the start. And that's an indication, and if you notice that in yourself, it's great, because it means that you only have those 3 ways. You know, if you revert 1, 2, 3 times, and then you're back at the original way again, that means you only have 3 ways of dealing with that particular false belief, and that's it. You only have 3 ways of suppressing it. Right? But some of us have 10 ways of suppressing, or 12 ways, or 15. It depends on how many times we've been challenged in our life as to how many ways we created to avoid the feeling of the addiction, the feeling of the belief, which is why your addictions get created. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, it's important for you to know that, because if you can know that, you can deconstruct those ways. You can confront those ways that you use. Notice them and see them for what they are, as just a way of avoiding a belief that's false. Right? So, can I ask you what you might use, for example, with fear? So your favourite avoidance of fear might be food. Many people have that. So, you know, I'm afraid, just go and have a meal, feel all full up again. Right? Don't have to feel much when you're all full up again. Many also have hot drink. Favourite way of avoiding fear, hot drink. So they revert to hot drink as their first method. And then when somebody points out, you're having a hot drink to avoid your fear, bang, there comes the second method. You know, the second method might be denial. No, I don't. You know, I don't do that. I'm not afraid. I like the coffee that I'm drinking. It's good for me. How dare you say it's bad for me? You know, and that's our intellectual reasoning that we're reverting to now to avoid that exposure of the first method. And often we'll be having the first method while we're talking about the second one. You know, we get pretty bad like that. But there are many times that we only have a few methods. So you don't need to be very afraid about dealing with all of these addictions, because many times it's quite easy to expose the methods. And also, by the way, many times you use the same method on 25 different addictions. So as long as you on 25 different beliefs, I'm saying, sorry. So you might use one addiction method for 25 different beliefs. And once you get rid of that one addiction method that you're using, what's left to feel? The belief that you've been covering with it. And there might be 25 beliefs, so you might cry for a few days. Released quite a lot of different beliefs just by getting rid of one addiction and feeling one addiction. And then other ones, you have one belief and it takes you 25 different addictions before you get to it. And that's how big they are. You know, they've been challenged a lot through your life. You've avoided them over and over and over again using different methods. So you're now going to have to be quite diligent in deconstructing the set of addictions before you get to the belief. Does that make sense? And I wanted to let you know that, because don't think that just because you've deconstructed one addiction that everything's going to be fine, but also don't think that just because you've deconstructed that there's going to be 25 addictions for every single belief that you've got. And remember, I said you might have thousands of beliefs. So don't think that either. Sometimes there is complete leakages and you've just got to relax with the process and start going through it. And the other thing I'd like to suggest to you is this. Start with your biggest addictions. And the reason why I suggest that to people is because your biggest addictions usually cover over lots and lots of fears and beliefs. They are your go-to guys. Right? And if you can start with what you notice is a big way you deal with something. So, for example, if you have some kind of physical addiction, like an alcohol abuse problem, well, I would suggest to you at the moment, if you have an alcohol abuse problem, then basically the alcohol abuse is your biggest addiction. Right? And it's helping you cover over hundreds of beliefs, probably. So get rid of it. Go through the process of feeling your way through the addiction. Feel the way through the addiction. Stop the addiction. Stop taking action on the addiction. Remember, every time you take an action on the addiction, you're shoving down the experience of the belief. If you allow yourself to release the addiction, right, in other words, don't engage it anymore, don't do it anymore, then you're now exposing the belief. Right? So if you stop, if you're abusing alcohol, work on the abuse of alcohol. Stop it at all costs. Do whatever you can to stop it. And that doesn't mean taking up another addiction. Stop the abuse of the addiction, because a lot of things will come up even in your attempt to stop it. Even just the attempt to stop it, all sorts of addictions will show up. And you'll be able to expose a lot of things in that process. Just the attempt. So start with your biggest addictions. In other words, start with the actions that you notice that you do the most to avoid feeling your childhood beliefs. Right? Now, for some of you, it's just as simple as you don't speak up. You don't say anything. You sit there and don't engage, don't say anything, don't engage, don't say anything. And you'll sit in a place for a week without saying anything, or longer sometimes, right? And that might be your biggest addiction. So start challenging it. Do the opposite. So that's the second suggestion I have. To do the opposite of what the addiction demands. What the addiction demands. So if the addiction says don't talk, talk. If the addiction says talk, don't talk. Do you see what I'm saying? So you don't have to relate to anybody else here because it's your stuff. So, there are some people who talk because they're avoiding, and there's other people who don't talk because they're avoiding. You need to feel about which one you are and do the opposite. Does that make sense? When you do the opposite, you start confronting the addiction. When you start tearing away the addiction, the underlying childhood beliefs start coming up. So, for example, if you stop talking, all the underlying childhood feelings of I want to be heard, all start coming up, right? But if you don't talk and you start talking, all the underlying feelings of I'm going to get exposed, I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to have somebody attack me, all start coming up. Does that make sense? And this is why you need to be sensitive to your own. You can't go and discuss it with somebody else because they might talk too much for completely the opposite reason that you don't, for completely the opposite reasons that you have. So it's pointless having a chat about it. You need to feel what it is inside of you that's causing you to take the action and then do the opposite of what the action dictates. Nina, thanks.
Using the example of talking, what I'm starting to see, my dad wouldn't talk for weeks at a time. So there's a thing of, it's like there's two conflicting addictions now. One is I talk to fill up that empty, angry space.
Yep.
And then the other is, well, just get out of the way and shut up so you don't get into trouble. So it's almost like there's two opposing things.
Yeah, but they only come out in opposing in different situations.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Right.
So, and again, if you just stop the addiction, if you can feel it coming up in the situation, you stop the addiction, you do the opposite in the situation of what the addiction wants you to do.
Gotcha.
So in one case, you might even have an addiction that causes you to want to speak. In that case, shut up and see what it feels like. But in the other case, you might have an addiction that feels you want to not speak, and if that's the case, speak up.
So it's this attention to self-awareness and where you find yourself.
Exactly. There's no rule aside from do the opposite of what the addiction demands. You can't say, if you've all got this addiction, then it means you've got to do this. Because the reality is for each of you, if you have that addiction, it might mean completely the opposite things. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Remember that the belief systems inside of your families are very, very different from each other. So you can't really go comparing notes as to why you do it compared to somebody else doing it. Does that make sense? And in fact, the attempt to compare notes is an addiction in itself, usually. What we need to do is feel why we do it, rather than focusing on why does somebody else do it and then thinking, oh, well, that's probably like that for me too. Don't assume that. Because sometimes it can be completely the opposite to that. So the key is for you to feel your biggest addictions and work your way through them one by one and do the opposite of what that addiction dictates to you in this moment. Yeah? So for many of you, your addiction dictates in a group like this to not ask a question. That's the addiction. So ask a question. Does that make sense? And if the law of attraction is working perfectly, my answer or my refusal to answer will trigger something inside of you that will cause you to see why you engage that addiction. Does that make sense? So for many of you, you're asking question after question after question. Well, shut up for a while. Let somebody else ask the question. But you've got to feel what you feel. Like if you feel, as I pointed out to you the other night, a lot of your questioning is over and over. What was your name again? Catherine, that's right. Catherine's feeling was over, ask another question, and not even hear the answer to the previous question. And as I pointed out to Catherine, it was this feeling of just wanting to engage the male and have his attention. That's all she was wanting. She just wanted me to engage with her. And that's her addiction with men, wanting the man's attention. And she's learned from her father, obviously, that asking question after question after question after question without even evaluating any of the answers is a great way of the man feeling like she's engaged. Even though it doesn't feel that way to me, but that's the way it must have felt in your childhood to someone else, right? So this is where you go, oh, I'm asking another question. Okay, what I'll do now is I'll just shut up for a bit and feel what it feels like to not be able to ask the question. Does that make sense? Just feel it. Feel the addiction in play. And if you feel the addiction and you eventually feel it and remember you have to feel it for it to be released. So feel the addiction in play and you'll start to feel it and release it as an emotion, as an emotional imperative. And once that happens, it's the underlying belief that is going to be exposed. And honestly, you'll just naturally, as soon as you get rid of most of these addictions regarding that belief, one day you'll just be walking along and some event will trigger the belief, and because all of your addictions to covering it over are gone, what's going to happen? You just break down in the middle of anywhere and just have a ball about it and then it's done. Does that make sense? Really simple. And Catherine wants to ask a question.
It's a question about asking questions. Well, more a statement. When I went to Australia to see you, I was too afraid to ask a single question. And I flew all the way to Australia and came back
without
ever asking a question. So I sort of felt this time, be brave, you know, because I regretted that.
So you confronted one addiction
yeah.
only to expose another.
Another, yeah,
Does
that's
that make sense?
interesting. Yeah.
So the confrontation of the other addiction was you were too afraid, so fear was driving you. In this case, it's not fear that drove your addiction, it's the desire to have the man's engagement.
Yes.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Different addiction.
Yeah.
So don't be surprised if you finish up finding yourself doing different things with different addictions. Right? That's okay. The key is this is just the basics of it, confront what the addiction demands you do. So when you're over in Australia, what you would have done if you confronted the fear, you would have put your hand up and engaged. Here, you can feel yourself engaging all the time, to the exclusion oftentimes of others. You go, okay, this is another addiction in play. Does that make sense? So what does this addiction demand? It demands that I ask questions, so I won't. And I'll just see what that feels like. And you'll feel all sorts of things. You feel like you're missing out. You feel, lots of different things you'll feel. So.
It would be interesting to go through all of our sharing with you in the last 2 hours and look at the addictions that we were working out while we were doing it.
Yeah.
That would be...
Yeah. And remember I said to you last night at dinner, I said you don't realise that many of your addictions are in play at dinner. So why don't you use this? We're going to have dinner soon, right? Another half an hour or so. Why don't you use this opportunity at dinner times just to stay connected with what you're feeling while you're at dinner. It doesn't matter who's opposite you or with you or whatever. Stay connected with what you're feeling and go, okay, what's pushing me to do this? What am I doing here? So some of you will find, you're not really being honest with the person with you. Or you find you're not really sharing yourself with the person with you. Others of you are sharing yourself to the exclusion of the people around you. You'll find all sorts of addictions in play if you allow yourself to just be self-reflective. So obviously, all of what I've said today and all of what I said 2 days ago is going to be very dependent on you being self-reflective, isn't it? You're not going to get very far with these addictions unless you're self-reflective. And I suggest to you, you're not going to get very far in your relationship with God unless you go through this process looking at your addictions. You're just not going to get very far with your relationship. Yeah? Patricia?
Hi. So it sounds like number 2 is way more important than number 1. Do we really need to list all 1,000 beliefs that we have?
Well, number 2 is often you're more aware of number 2. So usually it's the awareness. It works in reverse many times, where your awareness is firstly that you obviously feel like you've got to do something, and that's an indication generally of an addiction, before you feel why you've got to do it. Does that make sense? But it's a very good process still to go through. And what I've tried to do today is show you the relationship between avoiding the belief and what you do to avoid a belief. Does that make sense? But yes, you're right. Most of the time when we're trying to deconstruct this, we've got to look at what we're doing and then see and feel what we're doing. And once we feel what we're doing, what will be left is the exposure of the feeling that drives what we do. Does that make sense? So yes, you're right. It's a action in reverse, basically. But what I've been trying to do is show you how it was constructed, and now you need to do the opposite of how it was constructed, to deconstruct it.
But it's also helpful if I'm aware of these beliefs from my childhood, then...
Of course. Many of you are aware of childhood beliefs, but you're not aware of the addictions you use to avoid them. You know that? So many of you have no fear of actually talking about your childhood belief. And you know why that is? Because you have no fear that you'll ever get to feel it. Because you have so many addictions covering, you know even talking about it's not going to get you to feel it. You know that, right? And this is so many of you know these quite well because you're not afraid they're ever going to come up, because you've got so many addictions that have been pasted on top of them to keep them down.
So the ones that we're aware of are probably the ones that we have the most addiction covering.
Oftentimes, yes. Yeah. If you're aware of a childhood belief but you're not feeling it, there's a high level of addiction covering it. Yes. High levels of addiction. Because to cover over something you are aware of is harder than covering over something you're not aware of. Does that make sense? So that is very much the case. So I would still look at both of the beliefs and the addictions, certainly. And, that's what myself and Mary are doing. We look at childhood beliefs, that we have not just as a result of our childhood, but all of our life. in the first century life, spirit world life as well, reflected through our parents' emotions. And we also look at what we do to avoid it. And sometimes we even discuss, we choose certain addictions in order to avoid other addictions. And you will notice that too. So in other words, certain addictions feel bad to you. So what you do is you try to avoid engaging that addiction by choosing another. Yeah? And you'll notice all these things the more self-aware you become. So Selena and then